spent over 2 decades now in China. The last 22 years have been very significant, very consequential, not just for China, but for the world. So we'd love to hear how you've seen the country really evolve over the last 2 decades.
It's been a really fascinating place from which to watch the world. There are, broadly speaking, two successful paths to development. One of them I would call the high wages, high consumption path, which is what the US follows. There's another model, and that I call the high savings, high investment model. China followed this model, but they didn't invent it. You could argue that the Soviet Union and Germany in the 1930s invented it. Japan followed this model, South Korea, Taiwan, many economies followed this model.
Talk to us about where you see the Chinese economy today.
Decoupling and trade conflict worries Beijing enormously, and it should. Geopolitics have made things worse. They are a real problem. Some would even say panic at the policy-making level. There is a recognition that all of this infrastructure spending didn't lead to enough growth to justify the debt, which is why so many Chinese provinces are basically bankrupt. China has real difficulty raising the consumption share of GDP. Consumption isn't low because Chinese people don't like to consume. You've lived in China. You know Chinese people are just as happy as anybody else to consume.
Essentially, you're saying that this shift that the Chinese economy needs to make is going to be very hard to make. As a result, lower growth rates to continue?
I think we're moving to a world in which massive flows of capital are going to be more and more constrained. I'm old enough, and I suspect you are too, to remember that every technological breakthrough is going to transform the world and cause productivity to double. It never actually does, but maybe one day it will.
Welcome to today's episode of the Great Tech Game podcast, where we host smart, insightful, big picture conversations with some of the world's best thinkers on technology, geopolitics, economics, and much more. And today I'm delighted to have with me Professor Michael Pettis. With so much going on around the world, industrial policy, trade policy, imbalances around the world, I think we couldn't have any other better guest to talk us through some of these issues. Michael is a finance professor at Peking University, at Beda, and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment. Before moving to China in 2002, Michael spent 15 years on Wall Street at JP Morgan, first Boston, and Bear Stearns. And during the last of these 9 years, I believe, spent about 9 of those years teaching finance at Columbia as well. He's published over 200 articles in various leading periodicals, along with 6 books, the most recent of which I've read, Trade Wars Are Class Wars, which I think is something we'll delve deeply into. That book won the Lionel Gilbert Prize as well. His previous book, Avoiding the Fall, China's Economic Restructuring, which came out in 2013, was selected by the FT as one of the top 10 books on business and economics in 2013. And he's also written a book called The Great Balancing, which in 2018 was selected among Barron's the 7 best books about the financial crisis. He's received an MBA in finance and an MIA in development economics from Columbia. And without going too much more into your bio, Michael, I'm excited to welcome you to our podcast today. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Anirudh. It's a pleasure.
Michael, we were just talking, you've spent over 2 decades now in China. So before we get into more serious, substantive economic issues, I thought I'll ask you to reflect for a few minutes on that journey. 22 years is a long time in any country. But of course, in China's case, the last 22 years have been very significant, very consequential, not just for China, but for the world. So we'd love to hear maybe a few reflections of how you've seen the Chinese economy and the country really evolve over the last 2 decades.
Well, yes, as you mentioned, before moving here, I worked on Wall Street, where I ran fixed income trading and capital markets desks. And I specialized in Latin America. I was running Latin American capital markets for Bear Stearns. And things had been, in the beginning, very, very interesting. You'll remember that in the 1980s, Latin America was in serious debt problems. And it all emerged in the 1990s. But by 2000, 2001, Wall Street had become very very cookie cutter almost, the deals that we were doing. Every deal was the same as the last one. And I thought I'd spend a couple of years going to some big economy that I knew very little about. And the two big ones were, of course, India and China. And for some reason, I decided to go to China. It was really not much more complicated than that. I decided to go as a professor for a couple of years and then return to New York, return to Wall Street. And so I went. At first I taught at Tsinghua University, which is, as you know, one of the top two Chinese schools. And after 2 years, I decided that I really wasn't ready to go back yet because it was such an exciting place to be in many, many ways. As an economist, as in a finance person, there was so much happening in China. But also culturally, socially, politically, things were moving so rapidly that it seemed to me that, I was not ready to leave yet. So I went to the other one of the two big universities, Peking University, and I asked if they would be interested in taking me on. And they did. And I've been there basically for 22 years at Tsinghua and 20 years at Peking University. And during that time, needless to say, the changes have been enormous. So I would say during the first decade, you really felt that China was opening them up so rapidly and changing so quickly. As an aside, I got very involved in the development of a music scene here in Beijing. I started a music label, 2 music clubs, etc. And it seemed at the time that, within a decade or two, Beijing would be one of the great cultural centers of the world. Maybe not New York or London, but not that far behind. In the second decade, a lot of that closed up very rapidly. It was quite disappointing. And I would no longer make that statement about Beijing as a cultural center. But you saw enormous changes from the first 10 years to the second 10 years. And meanwhile, as I don't need to tell you, the role of China in the global economy, and particularly in the developing world, has only gotten greater and greater. So it's been a really fascinating place from which to watch the world. And in fact, one of the things I tell my students is that when you look at many of the global imbalances, the problem of debt, the problem of excess savings, weak demand, in China, they're sharper than they are in the rest of the world. So this becomes a very good place from which to try to understand the global economy.
Yeah. No, fascinating. I know we'll get into a lot more insights about the Chinese economy that you've built over the last 2 decades with your work and time there. But I want to start us off now by asking you to give me your economic worldview, right? Some of which I know came out in your most recent book, Trade Wars Are Class Wars, where you speak a lot about the economic and financial imbalances. I think that's the lens through which you view a lot of the economic development that's happening in China as well. As you mentioned, Latin America back in the day as well. But walk us through the central thesis in your book, Trade Wars Are Class Wars, and also maybe weave in your economic worldview of the theories of economic development of countries, and of course how trade and these financial and debt imbalances that you've spoken about factor into economic development paths of countries.
Well, one of the things that I admire very much about John Maynard Keynes was that he took a very systemic and logical point of view. He was often accused of arguing from accounting identities. And as he kept saying, no, you can't argue from accounting identities, but you need to keep them in place at all times. As long as you keep them in place, then many of the obvious mistakes that many economists and policymakers make, you can't make. And I have a great deal of sympathy for that point of view. So I really think of myself as sort of a balance of payments guy. I think about the global economy as a system, a closed system, obviously. And as every country, whether it's the US, China, Japan, or Germany, as a open system within that closed system. So if you're a small economy like Singapore, you can sort of ignore the global constraints. If you're India, you can't ignore the global constraints because you're too big within that system. If there is a basic worldview that I have, it's basically that. You've got to keep the balance of payments in balance, and you've got to always think about it globally. So that has some really important consequences. Again, to use the example of India, because India is big enough, anything that affects the relationship between savings and investment in India, by definition, affects India's balance of payments through the trade account and the capital account. And therefore, the rest of the world's balance of payments, its trade account and its capital account, is affected, which further means that the relationship between investment and savings in the rest of the world must be affected. So that's a way of saying that you simply can't ignore what's happening in the rest of the world. Even the U.S. and Americans, one of the big sins of American economists is this perception that the U.S. is sort of sui generis. It has total agency. Everything that the U.S. does for domestic purposes, and then the rest of the world reacts. And I would argue that that's a very mistaken view. For example, it's widely known that the U.S. has a very low savings rate. And many American economists will say the U.S. savings rate is a function of American conditions. And because of the low U.S. savings rate, by definition, the U.S. must run a current account deficit because the current account deficit is equal to investment minus savings. So if you have a low savings rate, you must have a current account deficit. And one of the things that I pointed out both in this book and in my 2013 book, The Great Rebalancing, is that that's completely wrong. In fact, the U.S. is one of the few countries in the world that has almost no control over its savings rate. And this is at the heart of the argument of trade wars or class wars. In that book, I argued that as long as foreigners export excess savings to the United States, then the U.S. must run, by definition, a capital account surplus, which also means that, by definition, it must run a capital account deficit. But notice the direction of causality. Many people would say the U.S. runs a deficit, so therefore foreigners must export capital to the U.S., as if what foreigners were doing was trade finance. So it's as if a Chinese billionaire will pick up the newspaper and say, oh my God, the U.S. trade deficit is going up. I better ship some of my money to the U.S. to help finance it. That's not what happens, as you know. What typically happens is that lots of decisions are made around the world about what to do with excess capital. All the surplus countries, by definition, have excess savings. And for a variety of reasons, political reasons, governance reasons, legal reasons, the quality of the financial markets, most of this excess savings, or roughly half, goes to the United States. And interestingly enough, most of what's left goes to the other three Anglophone economies, England, Canada, and Australia, who all have very similar financial markets, governance, legal structures, etc. So what that tells us is that foreign investors make the decision to invest in the U.S. for domestic reasons, reasons having to do with China, Europe, Japan, India, Brazil, whatever. It's got nothing to do with the needs of the U.S., but it has to affect the U.S. economy. And as money flows into the U.S., again, by definition, the U.S. runs a capital account surplus and a current account deficit, which means by definition, there has to be a gap between investment and savings. So how does that gap occur? And here I think is one of the innovations of the book. I argue that, the answer is the correct answer for all economic questions. It depends. So in the United States in the 19th century, we had very high investment needs, very low domestic savings. So we depended on foreign capital inflows, mainly from England and the Netherlands, to boost our domestic savings. To boost our domestic savings, which allowed us to boost our domestic investment. So if you look at investment in the U.S., it goes up and down in line with the British decision, the British and Dutch decisions to export capital to the U.S. or to stop exporting capital. Every time England had a crisis, we had a crisis because capital stopped coming in. So that's the good story, right? As a developing country, foreign inflows boost your domestic investment. But I argued that that's not a universal law. It depends. Developing countries have insufficient savings to fund their needed investment. It's a problem in India, for example. But advanced economies don't have that problem. If you look at American companies or European companies, they were sitting on huge piles of cash. And they were able to borrow at very low interest rates. In fact, for many years at negative interest rates. And yet they didn't. They didn't because they didn't have the need to expand investment. They were constrained not by low savings, but by weak domestic demand. In that case, if foreigners add to the savings pool, if American businesses have already decided there isn't enough demand for us to expand investment, just because a Chinese billionaire decides to take money out of the country and put it in the U.S., that's not going to cause Americans to say, oh, now we're going to invest, right? It has no impact at all. So investment doesn't go up. But the gap between investment and savings must go up. And so what that means is that savings goes down. This is the part that's very hard for people to understand because they think savings is a cultural factor. Americans culturally have low savings. It's not true. What ends up happening is that savings goes down because the inflows cause structural changes in the economy. The most obvious way savings can go down is as the U.S. runs a current account deficit, a trade deficit. That means American companies that used to sell products to American consumers are now buying them from foreigners. So the American companies have to close down production and fire workers. Now, an unemployed worker, by definition, has a negative savings rate. So by firing workers, by unemployment going up, your savings rate goes down. And that's how you balance the inflow. So savings goes down as capital flows in, your current account deficit widens. But of course, Washington doesn't want unemployment to go up. So there's two things they can do. One thing is the Fed can decide to fight unemployment by lowering interest rates and expanding credit to the household sector. In that case, American households borrow money and consume. They spend it on consumption, and that absorbs the unemployed American workers. The other thing Washington can do is expand the fiscal deficit, and there are many ways they can expand it, but all of them basically have the effect of raising employment. So the point that I want to make is that when excess savings from countries like China, Germany, Japan, the Netherlands, South Korea, when they flow into developing countries, they represent an expansion of global demand that matches their own weak domestic demand. Excess savings just means your domestic demand is very weak. And so in that case, you balance it with more investment in developing countries. That's a good thing. But what typically happens in our world, where most excess savings don't go to developing countries, between 60 to 80% of all excess savings go to just 4 countries, the United States, the UK, Canada, and Australia, then it doesn't boost investment. It reduces savings in those countries, and it does so through some combination of higher unemployment, higher household debt, or higher fiscal deficits. And I don't need to tell you that since the 1980s, it's been higher household debt and higher fiscal deficits.
So I have a couple of questions, right? So that I want to try and use to illustrate what you've just described, right? I think for most students of economics, a lot of those terminologies might not make too much sense. So one, I want to try and maybe illustrate, let's start with a Chinese household, Chinese government, or an Indian household, Indian government, and end up with your US household, US government, and US company. So if you were to use those two sets of actors, tell us what's happening again using those households. Is the Chinese or Indian household, let's start with them. Now, they are spending, saving at certain levels. How does that impact what's happening in the US?
Let's assume there are only two countries, the US and China, just to make the calculation easier. And let's assume they're in equilibrium in the sense that the Chinese are consuming an amount equal to what they're producing. The US households are consuming an amount equal to what they're producing, technically consuming and investing. And so there's no trade surplus, no trade deficit. There's trade, but exports are equal to imports, which is really how a well-functioning trading environment should work. The purpose of exports should be to pay for imports. That's the main purpose of exports. But then let's say the Chinese government does something that changes the domestic relationship between production and consumption. So, for example, they could depreciate the currency. That's the easiest one to think about. But there are many things they could do. They could lower interest rates. They could outlaw labor unions. They could reduce the social safety net. They could lower wages. But I'll focus on depreciating the currency. How does depreciating the currency work? Most economists think about price effects, which is the wrong way to think about it. When you think systemically, you should always think income effects. When the renminbi, the Chinese currency, goes down, that's basically a transfer from net importers to net exporters, right? So a lower currency means that your import costs go up. So if you're an importer, you lose money. And if you're an exporter, you get a higher profit, so you gain money. It's just a transfer. But it's a very important transfer because what happens is that households, with the exception of subsistence farmers, all households are net importers, right? And who are the net exporters? The tradable goods sector. So when you depreciate the currency, what you're actually doing is you're transferring income from households to manufacturers. Households are worse off, manufacturers are better off. That has a very important component because it means the household share of GDP has dropped, right? Now, most consumption is household consumption. So it used to be, let's say, the average Chinese worker produced $100 worth of goods and his income was $80 and he spent whatever, $75 on consumption. That meant China saves $25, $5 from the household and $20 from the rest of the economy. And if it invests $25, everything is balanced. But now they do a big depreciation of the currency. So now the average Chinese worker still produces $100, but his salary is only, say, $70. And so he consumes maybe $65. Now the savings of China is $5 of household savings plus $30 from the rest of the economy, because savings is just GDP minus consumption. But if China only invests $25, if it continues to invest $25, it now produces $100 and consumes and invests $90. So there's $10 of excess savings, and that goes to the US, right? Because there's only two countries. By going to the US, it drives up the value of the dollar. Now, of course, in a two-world economy, I don't need to explain that to you, because if the renminbi goes down, by definition, the dollar goes up, right? But that's the mechanism by which the dollar goes up. So what happens in the US? You have the exact opposite. A appreciating dollar transfers income from manufacturers to the household sector, right? In exactly the obverse of the way it did in China. So as a result, the household share of the US goes up and the manufacturing share goes down. With the rise in the household share, the consumption share goes up. which means by definition, American savings must go down. Not because Americans changed their cultural attitude towards savings, but simply because of the shift in income. So notice what's happening. The depreciation of the currency in China forced Chinese households to subsidize Chinese producers. Fair enough. We all understand that. But it also forced American producers to subsidize American consumers, right? And that's the point we often forget. So in that type of system, we should expect China to run a surplus, the US to run a deficit, and we would expect manufacturing to migrate to China, where it receives higher subsidies, and consumption to migrate to the US, where it receives higher subsidies. So we would expect eventually the manufacturing share of China's GDP would go up, and the manufacturing share of US GDP would go down. The opposite would happen with consumption. So let me tell you what the numbers are. Globally, manufacturing is 16% of global GDP. In China, it's 28% of Chinese GDP. In the US, it's 11%. And then globally, consumption is 75% of global GDP. In the US, it's something like 81%. And in China, it's an astonishing 56%, which is exactly what we would expect under this system. And that's the system we live in.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks for laying that out. I think very clear. Now, can you link all of this now to the arguments you make in the book that, and I'll quote you here maybe, that you have trade wars because you have these persistent imbalances, right? And also talk to us about how this then links to what you've described as class wars, or how income doesn't get distributed in an equitable manner between the different classes within any given country.
Yeah. And that's the key message of the book. We typically think of trade wars as conflicts between countries. So we think about China and the US as engaged in a trade war, and either the US will win and China will lose, or China will win and the US will lose. And, I argue that that's the very wrong way to think about it. Because what ends up happening is that trade war is a conflict between economic sectors. We called it class wars to be provocative, but it's not so much classes as economic sectors. So what ends up happening? Again, to use my old example, China implemented a change that lowered the real income of Chinese households. That's why I say they could do it by lowering wages. They could do it by a tax on savings, an inflation tax on savings. There's many ways they can do it. But the net impact is that the wage share of GDP, the household income share of GDP, goes down. So you become successful in trade by basically screwing your workers, right? And if you look at all the surplus countries, all of them, the household share of GDP is lower than that of their trade partners. So you can go to Germany, you can go to Japan, and on and on. That's how you become competitive, right? You're not competitive because you're efficient. You're competitive because ultimately workers get paid less as a share of what they produce. Now, this
has nothing to do. This is nothing to do as a result. You're arguing with, let's say, better equipment, better machinery, better technology,
no,
etc. You're saying it's ultimately just the workers' wages.
All those things matter. But what typically happens is that if you improve the productivity of your production, right, your exports should go up. But because your exports go up and your revenues go up, you should be paying your workers more. And so your workers are going to go out and spend that consumption, that additional income. Some of it they'll import. Others they'll spend at home, but that becomes income for other workers who then import some, spend it at home, and on and on. So in that case, your exports go up. You're efficient. You've done well. But your reward is that your imports go up. Now, in countries like China, Germany, etc., exports go up, but imports don't, because workers don't get the benefit of the increase in productivity.
Yeah, yeah. No, great. So I think now that we've laid this out, the other piece of the book that maybe we can delve into before we get into the Chinese economy and what's happening there today is all the history that you've spoken about in the context of the US as it tries to make this transition from a largely agricultural economy to a industrial economy, a manufacturing-driven economy. And I want to lay that out now because I know when we start discussing about the international economic order and the changes we're seeing there and the industrial policy trend that we're seeing, it'll be very interesting to draw upon that history.
Yeah, the way I see it, and this is really the 30,000-foot view, is that there are, broadly speaking, two successful paths to development. One of them I would call the high wages, high consumption path, which is what the U.S. followed. So remember, in the 19th century, the U.S. had the highest wages in the world, higher than England or higher than any other country. And how does that drive growth? Well, high wages create great domestic demand, and depending on how you structure your economy, ideally you would have a very competitive domestic manufacturing sector that competes to service that demand. Now, in the beginning, you may not be able to compete with foreigners, and the Alexander Hamilton, who I think was the greatest of all American statesmen, he understood that very clearly. He knew that the U.S. had to grow in manufacturing, but the U.S. simply couldn't compete with the English or even with the Dutch. So he developed what was called the infant industry argument. Let's protect our own manufacturers in order that they have some space to build up their level of expertise where they can compete with the British. And then we'll reduce the trade barriers because then we can compete. And a very important part of that model was that you need to encourage massive amounts of domestic competition, right? Because it's competition that drives productivity gains. And as wages are high, there's enormous pressure on businesses to invest in productivity-enhancing technology. So when you look at many of the most important American inventions of the 19th century, almost all of them were aimed at enhancing workers' productivity, right? So I would argue that that's a good, stable model. You protect your economy, but you don't have national champions, which I think may have been one of the problems in India, because national champions don't innovate. What you need is brutal domestic competition, like they have in China. And in that case, your growth feeds into your wages, which feeds back into your growth. Now, there's another model which can generate much more rapid growth. The problem is it generates enormous imbalances. And the difficulty has always been not the growth part, but the adjustment part. And that I call the high savings, high investment model. China followed this model, but they didn't invent it. You could argue that the Soviet Union and Germany in the 1930s invented it, because in both cases they had huge industrializing needs, but they weren't able to attract foreign capital for political reasons. So they forced up the domestic savings rate, and they channeled all of that savings into domestic investment. Japan followed this model, South Korea, Taiwan, many economies followed this model. So how does it work? You have to force up the domestic savings rate. And when you do, everybody becomes a cultural, relativist and say, you are in a country that has a cultural attraction to savings. It's nonsense. The way you force up the savings rate is you reduce the share of income that goes to the part of the economy that consumes ordinary people. Rich people consume very low share of their income. Businesses consume none. Governments consume a low share. So the trick is simple. Take money away from ordinary people, give it to the rich, give it to businesses, give it to the government. Is that a bad strategy? Not necessarily. That's the trickle-down theory, which many people say is voodoo economics. And again, that depends. In some cases, it works. In China in the 1990s, it worked because by creating this huge savings rate, basically taking money away from ordinary people, giving it to the rich and to government, and forcing all of the savings into domestic investment, you had massive investment-driven growth. So even though workers were technically getting screwed, the growth was so rapidly that they still did very well. But here's the problem with this model. It works if you have been destroyed by war, like Japan was after World War II, or like China was. Remember that when the model was implemented, China had gone through 5 decades of anti-Japanese war, civil war, and Maoism. So you need to be hugely underinvested for this to work.
And so that's a great segue now, I think, Michael, to start talking about a topic that is an extremely important topic, extremely consequential topic. It's all over publications like Foreign Affairs, is what's happening with the Chinese economy, right? Of course, the last 2-3 years of the geopolitical battle between the US and China seems to have an impact on it. Many people have argued that Xi Jinping, over the last decade, and some of his policy decisions have impacted the state of the Chinese economy today. COVID, of course, has been a factor. But I think from what I understand of what I've read about how you've thought about this, there are some structural reasons to this, which I think you were just trying to describe as well. So talk to us about where you see the Chinese economy today. Is the malaise that people are saying or attributing to the Chinese economy, is it real? Is it exaggerated? And what are the reasons you ascribe to it? What are some of the other reasons other economists are ascribing to it? And has geopolitics also played a role in this?
Geopolitics have made things worse. It's very fashionable to say that China's problems, and they are real problems. There is a real sense of frustration in China, nervousness. Some would even say panic at the policy-making level. And it's very fashionable to say that this is because President Xi made a whole bunch of mistakes in the last 5 years. I don't think that's true. I think what happened is, remember, we said the Chinese model, which was a high savings, high investment model, was implemented to a greater degree than any other country has ever done in history. And not surprisingly, it grew much more quickly. The problem with this model is that, there are 2 reasons you invest. One reason is because you have all these things you need and you just don't have them. And so you need to build them. That's your infrastructure, your manufacturing capacity. But once you have that, then what drives investment is demand. More demand, you invest more. Less demand, you invest less. When China started this, it was massively underinvested. It didn't have a single subway system in the country. It had 4 commercial airports and nothing. It had nothing. So it built massive amounts of infrastructure and manufacturing capacity, the fastest growth rate in investment in history. But the problem with this model is also the reason it's a good model. And that is you solve your problem of underinvestment. But once you solve it, it's no longer a good model. And when that happens, you have to shift the model. And that's the difficult part. That's the part every country has had trouble doing.
And so if I can build on that, they had to move from a high saving, high investment to a high consumption model. In India, of course, India is considered to be a high consumption economy. And so sometimes now it's being seen as a strength. A decade ago in India, it used to be said that, this is not a good model. We've got to become more of a high investment, high savings, and a high export-driven economy. But you're arguing that at some point China had to make that transition. When was that, and why wasn't it able to make that transition to a higher consumption economy? And is it still possible now?
Well, once you start investing non-productively, once you start building the famous bridges to nowhere, the incredible train system, those beautiful bridges in Guizhou province that are simply not justified economically, that's when you have to stop your investment. But if you stop your investment because GDP growth depends so much on investment, then GDP growth drops sharply. And if you want GDP growth to be maintained, then you can either continue investing, but now it's more and more non-productive investing, and you get that massive explosion in debt. We saw that in Japan in the 1980s. We've seen that in China in the last 15 years. Or you have to replace investment with consumption. But here's the problem. Consumption isn't low because Chinese people don't like to consume. You've lived in China. You know Chinese people are just as happy as anybody else to consume. The problem is that their share of income is very low. So you need to raise their share of income. And the big change in policy discussions in the last 4 or 5 years is finally there is a consensus that you need to raise the household share of income. What we're not discussing yet in China, which is inevitable, and that is if my share goes up, your share must go down by definition. So in that context, who are you and how do we get your share to go down? Well, there are 4 groups. There are households, there are foreigners, too small to matter, there are businesses, and then there's the government. And so if you want to increase the household share, you've got to either reduce the business share, which is really bad for the economy, or you have to reduce the government share, which I would submit to you is easy to say, but politically extremely difficult to do.
Yeah. So essentially you're saying that this shift that the Chinese economy needs to make towards a more consumption-driven economy is going to be very hard to make. And as a result, lower growth rates to continue?
Yes, well, there are 2 ways historically this has occurred. One way I call the American way, and that was in the early 1930s. The U.S. went through a massive rebalancing of income, but in a very negative way. GDP contracted by 35%. Household income contracted by only half of that. Brutally painful, but very quick, right? And then the U.S. economy started growing again. The other way is the Japanese way. After 1990, household consumption continued to grow, but very slowly, and GDP growth dropped basically to zero. And it took them about 30 years to adjust. So, which is the better way? There is no better way. The U.S. way is socially and politically very disruptive, but economically quite efficient. The Japanese way is the opposite.
So talk to us also about, in all of this, the theory that you just dismissed, that it was Xi Jinping's actions against the private sector that have led to some of this, which is a theory that I think in the issue of foreign affairs I was referring to, Adam Posen has put out. And I read with great interest your back and forth with him on this topic. Talk to us about, in a little bit more detail, about where he's still wrong. Because he refutes what you say, and then I want to get your response to that. So he has that argument, you refute that with what you just described, then he refutes what you say. So give me that second counter battle.
Adam Posen is a smart guy, and he made very many important points. I think sometimes Americans sort of have this almost ideological belief that if you grow, it must have been because of the private sector. And if you stop growing, it must have been because of the government. So he argues that the growth in the 90s and the 2000s was delivered by unleashing the private sector. I argue that that's not the case. It was delivered by these massive subsidies to the private sector in the form of low wages, incredibly cheap capital, amazingly good infrastructure that was worth less than it cost. But if you're a business, you don't care. You still benefit from it because you don't have to pay for the costs. The restrictions on labor mobility, et cetera, et cetera. Under those conditions, it's not at all surprised that China grew very rapidly. And the private sector powered that growth. But without these huge transfers from the household sector, engineered by government policies, that growth wouldn't have occurred. It occurred in Japan, it occurred in South Korea, it occurred in Brazil in the 1950s and 60s. It always works. But the problem is that once you run out of those obvious investments, then you need to shift. And way back in 2012, before Xi Jinping became party secretary, so I had no idea who was going to become party secretary, I said the next party, so the next Secretary General of the Communist Party in China is going to have to re-centralize the economy because it's going to be more and more difficult to manage an adjustment without a political disruption. So historically, countries that re-centralize don't have political disruption. Countries that don't, like Brazil in the 1980s, you get a big political disruption. So I would argue that the centralization of the economy was caused by the slowdown, whereas Adam argues the slowdown was caused by the centralization of the economy. And there's probably, back and forth within that. But I argue it would have occurred anyway. It had to occur.
Yeah. How is the sort of this decoupling efforts, this idea that the US and the Chinese economy, and in fact, let's say US plus friends, are adopting this China plus one economy, how is that going to shape the Chinese economy also, right? So one is the structural changes that you've spoken about. And then if you go back to the beginning of our conversation, you were talking about the closed system within which the Chinese economy operates, a closed global system within which they operate. Now that the linkages between China and the parts of the global system that have really driven a lot of Chinese growth also are going to get disconnected or more disconnected than they were, how is that going to impact the Chinese economy in your opinion?
Decoupling and trade conflict worries Beijing enormously, and it should. It's worsened by the geopolitical conflict, but I would argue that even without the geopolitical conflict, it was going to be a big problem. And the reason is quite straightforward. China has real difficulty raising the consumption share of GDP. So either they allow GDP growth to drop, which they're not, or they must keep investment very high. Now, there's roughly three big areas of investment. There's property, infrastructure, and manufacturing. In the property sector, I don't need to tell you, investment is contracting, and it has been for many years, and it will be for many more years. There's a real problem there. It's not coming back. On infrastructure, investment continues to grow, but they're trying to slow the growth down because there is a recognition that all of this infrastructure spending didn't lead to enough growth to justify the debt, which is why so many Chinese provinces are basically bankrupt. So they want.
So this is now at this point unproductive.
Yeah, massively unproductive. So that leaves the third area, manufacturing. So in the first area, it's contracting. In the second area, it's growing slowly. Overall, it needs to grow rapidly. So what's happening is a big shift of investment out of the property sector into manufacturing. Will that work? Well, here's the problem. Manufacturing, China is 17% of the world economy. It accounts for only 13% of global consumption, but it accounts for 31% of global manufacturing. And by shifting into manufacturing, even without the shift, if they depend on manufacturing for growth, what that means is that China's share of manufacturing, global manufacturing, must rise at twice the share of China's share of global GDP and at 3 to 4 times the pace of China's share of global consumption. So when you're 31% of the world, 31% of global manufacturing, if you want to keep expanding your share faster than you expand your share of global demand, you need the rest of the world to accommodate that. The rest of the world must agree, we will give up manufacturing to help you out. And I would say even without geopolitical conflict, the rest of the world wasn't going to do that. The political conflict makes it worse, but the US has said no. Europe has said no. India has said no. Japan has said no. And that's basically the world. There's not much left.
Yeah. And therefore?
Therefore, we're going to have tremendous conflict. One of the ways this will show up is there will be massive Chinese manufacturing expansion in the developing world. That's a problem too. For example, if you're Brazil, you produce a lot of cars. You're not that excited about giving up your car manufacturing, but we're going to see more pressure there. But ultimately, I think that China has 3 options. It can go back to the bad old model and just build more and more trains, and ultimately debt will constrain that. Or it can allow GDP growth to drop sharply and just say, look, the days of 5% growth are over. We're now 2%, which I think is politically hard to accept. They'll accept it eventually, but in the short term. Or they'll have to start transferring income to the household sector to boost consumption. So far, they've been really reluctant to do that. But arithmetically, those are the options. There's nothing else.
Yeah, so one of those things has to give. So either you end up with a decade or so of just steadily, maybe with slowly declining GDP growth rates, or you figure out a way to push up your household consumption.
Yeah, there's a third. There's a third thing which they're betting on, and that is if you spend enough on technology, you'll achieve a major technological breakthrough that will cause such a surge in productivity that you can pay for the adjustment out of the surge in productivity. That's theoretically possible. It's never happened before. The great technological breakthroughs, electricity, the steam engine, they take 10, 20, 30 years to work themselves out. But, maybe it's possible. I'm very skeptical. But without that, you either boost consumption, continue misallocating investment, let GDP growth drop.
And that bet on the technology piece, Michael, is going to be on artificial intelligence? Is that your sense from?
I'm old enough, and I suspect you are too, to remember that every technological breakthrough is going to transform the world and cause productivity to double. And it never actually does, but maybe one day it will.
Let's now move. We've gone into history, we've gone into China. Let's now move again, slightly more macro, and start talking about the international economic order. Right? There's, I think, now a lot of conversation around how the international economic order, how globalization as we know it, how trade as we've known it, it's all changing, it's all transforming now. And we are on the cusp of, or maybe already in, I think the Economist's latest issue says, the new international economic order, right? So let's talk about that. Now, all of the same issues that we were talking about in the Chinese context, globalization, the geopolitics of it, the COVID piece, the US-China geopolitical battle, trade imbalances, a lot of stuff has been happening and building up to cause what people are now trying to say is now the emergence of a new international economic order. What's your view on that? What's changing? What's fundamentally changing? And what is that new international economic order likely to look like? What are going to be some of its key characteristics, key attributes?
I don't have any particular insights on politics, so I will only speak about the economic restructuring of the world. And we live in the kind of world that Keynes warned about in 1944 during Bretton Woods, that Joan Robinson wrote about in the 1930s. In the 1930s, we really understood this problem, and then we completely forgot it. And the world we live in is the way countries compete is by becoming, not by improving comparative advantage, because comparative advantage is only expressed in the exchange of goods. If you have comparative advantage in product X, you express that comparative advantage by producing X and then exchanging it with me for Y, which you don't have a comparative advantage. So in a world of comparative advantage, there are no big trade imbalances. The purpose of exports is to import. We don't live in that world. We live in the world that Keynes warned about, in which countries become competitive effectively by suppressing wages directly or indirectly. And the problem there is that means they produce more than they can absorb domestically. Now, in a closed economy, you can't do that. If you produce more than you absorb domestically, then you have to stop producing, which means unemployment goes up. But what Keynes warned, and what Joan Robinson warned in her famous 1936 essay, is that you can get rid of that problem by running persistent trade surpluses. She called it beggar my neighbor policy, which then turned into beggar thy neighbor. Basically, it involves exporting the consequences of domestic unemployment. And the problem with that is that if I compete with you by lowering my wages, the only way you can compete with me is by lowering your wages. So we're both pushing down demand. And if we all do that, global demand contracts. And the only way to counteract that is with a surge in global debt. So to me, it's not at all a surprise that in the US, debt is rising quickly. In China, debt is rising quickly. Everywhere you look, debt is rising quickly. This is not sustainable. So we need to move to a world, the kind of world that Keynes tried to create at Bretton Woods. He wasn't able to, in which we specifically target trade imbalances, right? You can export all you want, but the purpose of exports must be to import. If you don't import, you're suppressing domestic demand and exporting unemployment. So I think eventually we're going to move towards that system. The big question is whether we do it unilaterally. The U.S. does it unilaterally or through a new trade agreement. And the U.S. is in a very powerful position because as it absorbs nearly half of global trade surpluses, if the U.S. refuses to play that game, England, Canada, and Australia have no choice but to follow because they can't make up the difference, in which case deficits disappear, which by definition surpluses disappear. I think much better would be a group of like-minded countries got together and implemented a new trade policy where it was agreed that there were excessive imbalances, and we can define them in many ways, and there are penalties for running excessive imbalances. In that case, we move to a system of much more balanced trade. And this has one very important impact because remember, in the old world, we compete by lowering wages. The more you lower wages, the more you win. So in that world, you would expect wages to go down relative to GDP. And basically, since the 1980s, wages in the advanced economies have been flat, even as GDP grew. We need to move away from that. We need to reverse income inequality.
What's the implication of, let's say, of all of this for countries that are still developing? Countries like India, Vietnam, etc. Right? So a lot of conversation in India, for example, is do we copy or replicate in some ways the China economic growth model, right, over the next 20, 30 years? The other view there is that the world has changed, the world order has changed. You cannot actually, even if you wanted to, do that. Similarly, for a country like Vietnam, a lot of people are seeing Vietnam as being one of the main beneficiaries of this China plus one strategy, right? So all of that to say, okay, if you were sitting in India or a Vietnam or a similar country today that's looking at the next 20, 30 years very optimistically and saying, now is my time to grow rapidly, what's the implications for countries like that? What's the lessons for countries like that?
Well, that's a huge question, Anirudh, and if I could answer it, I would get a Nobel Prize tomorrow. I can't answer. But what I will suggest is that if we look historically, back in the 1960s, if you had asked most development economists, which are the successful countries of the future and which are the failures, everyone would have agreed that the clear winners were Latin America. And India would have been included as a likely winner. The clear losers were Africa and East Asia. We forget that East Asia was so desperately poor that, there was the sense that they were doing nothing right. But you know what's really interesting is that if you look at some of the explanations for East Asian poverty, we were told that they were Confucian societies, and Confucian societies traditionally don't value hard work and they don't value thrift. The great irony is 20 years later, their success is because they're Confucian societies that value hard work and value thrift. So the cultural argument to me is always really suspect. But something did change in the 1970s. In the 1970s, the great winners, Latin America, at the time the question was, how long will it take for Latin America to overtake Europe? Will it be this century? Now nobody would ask that question. That shifted. Sometime in the 1980s, the great winners were the so-called Asian tigers. And to me, that's really interesting because I would argue one of the big changes that took place in the 1970s was the opening up of capital markets, of the capital account to massive flows of capital. started probably by the accumulation of petrodollars in the 70s, when oil prices, as you know, went from $2 to $20 a barrel. And all of that money had to be recycled. Then countries that were open to foreign inflows were overwhelmed by foreign inflows, and basically that led to the great debt crises of the 1980s. And countries that weren't open to foreign inflows, they were the ones that were able to grow because basically they put into place the right capital constraints, capital controls, etc. I think we're moving to a world in which massive flows of capital are going to be more and more constrained.
Correct.
In Bretton Woods, Harry Dexter White and John Maynard Keynes disagreed on many things, but one thing they agreed was that a world of an open capital flows, unfettered flow of capital, made absolutely no sense. It was far more damaging than it could possibly help. So neither of them wanted unfettered free flow of capital. And for a long time, that became an ideological thing. Of course, the free flow of capital is nothing but positive. And you just look at one country after another being undermined by massive inflows and outflows. And what I've tried to add to that debate is that even the US is undermined by these persistent massive inflows. So I think we're moving to a world where we're going to be much more suspicious about capital flows, in which case that old model of importing small, stable amounts of foreign capital may once again become, the right way to grow, a demand-driven growth rather than a supply-driven growth.
Yeah. And what do you make of this whole trend towards industrial policy becoming fashionable again everywhere? The US obviously just imposed duties, right, on the Chinese EVs. Ms. Yellen has been talking about the overcapacity problems coming out of China as a way to justify also a lot of this industrial policy. If many countries move towards this industrial policy trend, as seems like might happen, not just the US, what does that mean for the world order also in terms of trade and other imbalances?
There will be much more conflict. Now, in the US, ideologically, there's this belief that industrial policy doesn't work, which is really ironic because the US probably invented industrial policy, or certainly they invented the modern version of it. It's been extremely successful for the US. But the point
This is going back to Hamilton.
Going back to Hamilton, to the American system of the 1830s, the highest tariffs in the world in the second half of the 19th century, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, there's no meaningful distinction between industrial and trade policy. They both accomplish the same effect. But the point that I would make is that you don't get to decide whether or not you have industrial policy, because as long as some countries implement aggressive forms of industrial policies, the rest of the world has an implicit industrial policy. That's the obverse. Remember, I told you about the currency. If China depreciates the currency, that's industrial policy. It's forcing households to subsidize producers. In the US, it's forcing producers to subsidize households. That's also an industrial policy. You may argue it's a very stupid industrial policy, but that's the point. You have it whether you like it or not. So what I would argue is that we need really to focus on industrial policies driven at home. The potential is for great conflict. So what we need are global agreements, trade agreements that accommodate that. Our current WTO system says you can distort trade as much as you like, as long as you don't do it by violating what are defined as trade intervention, right? All the other forms of violation are perfectly acceptable. And in that system, countries that don't respond have to absorb the consequences of countries that implement these industrial policies. So what we really need to do is move to a system where industrial policies are coordinated and balanced. And there will be conflict, there's no question. But, the argument that I would make is that the world we live in, there's plenty of conflict, and it's ultimately unsustainable. So, like it or not, we're going to shift to a world of more national policy.
And do you then anticipate the fact that, the US is imposing these tariffs, let's say, on China, but not necessarily on other friendly nations, do you expect that this industrial policy will in some ways be the harbinger for more regional trading blocks, or friends will continue to trade and industrial policy will be imposed, or tariffs will be really imposed only on unfriendly nations? And as well, do we see like almost two different trading blocks, as some people have hypothesized that we'll see two trading blocks, one US and everyone else they want to trade with, and then China and everyone else the Chinese want to.
I don't think so, Anirudh, because when you look at the American bloc, it's a massive deficit bloc. And when you look at the China bloc, China, Russia, Iran, they're all surplus countries. And it is impossible to have a deficit bloc that doesn't trade with the surplus bloc, right? So the whole system breaks down if you get a division in these two blocks because of their very, very different roles in the global economy. I think what's going to happen is we're going to have many missteps. Change is always frightening, but the option isn't should you change or should you not change. The option is should you change quickly or should you try to postpone adjustment as long as possible. I would argue changing quickly in the short term looks much more difficult, but postponing adjustment in the long term is ultimately self-defeating. By the way, a little advertisement for democracy. Democracies, the U.S., India, etc., they look like a total mess right now. But I would argue that every time, in the 1930s and the 1970s, democracy lost all of its prestige. And I would say that that was ironically because it was doing exactly what it's good at doing. In a democracy, you force the adjustment. And adjustment is never fun, but you force the adjustment. In an autocracy, you can prevent that adjustment from taking place for a while, and then you get a very disruptive adjustment. So I would argue that that's what's happening in a lot of these countries. We're going through a very messy adjustment.
But we've spoken about, the adjustment the Chinese economy needs. What's the adjustment that the US economy needs that it has to go through, you're saying?
I think if I could choose the adjustment, I would impose taxes on capital inflows. That will be ferociously opposed by Wall Street and by the foreign affairs establishment because the dominance of the dollar underlies the power of the U.S. in foreign affairs and underlies the dominance of Wall Street. But I would argue that that would benefit American businesses, manufacturers, producers, workers, etc., which I think is much more important. And that would be a step towards moving towards a much more balanced world. Now, notice the big difference between me and many other people is that we both agree we want balanced trade. But most people argue that the way to get balanced trade is to intervene in trade. And I always remind people that the trade account and the capital account are the same thing. So you need to see where the distortions come from. And if the distortions come from the capital account, then the best way to balance trade is to eliminate the distortions in the capital account. So I think we need to be much more suspicious about capital flows and the quality of capital flows.
No, great. This has been great, Michael. We end every podcast with two very simple questions and not the complicated and world-changing questions that we've been discussing so far, which is one, a recommendation you have for listeners of books, right? Other than, of course, yours or mine, that you would recommend for people who are interested in the kinds of topics we've been discussing today. And you can name more than one. And the second recommendation is for guests for the podcast.
Well, let me recommend the second one first, because that's easy. You can ask Brad Setzer, who is one of the great experts on the global balance of payments. We mentioned Adam Posen, the other Adam Tooze. These are really great guys to speak to. If you're interested in the global view, if you're interested in specific economies, there are other people you can speak to. On the issue of books, I get asked that question a lot, and I hate it because I read everything. But what I always tell my students is that if you want to cheat and become a better economist than the economists without working quite as hard. You should be reading economics and financial history. And I recommend
Yes.
everything. But for me, books like Barry Eichengreen's book or Adam Tooze's book on the 1920s and 1930s, that's the period where everything happened. And that's
Yeah.
a great place to really study.
Yeah, and particularly relevant today. It seems
Yes,
to me it's
very
interesting.
relevant today.
No, great. This has been fascinating. Thanks so much for sharing. Obviously sometimes your contrarian views, but also your deep insights into the structure of the Chinese economy and how that will impact, I think, the world order, and also your predictions for where the order should go or where it's likely to go. Thanks so much. This has been a fascinating discussion, and as I was saying earlier, of course, I hope that you come to India more often as well. I think many of the lessons I think that you've learned from the Chinese context, I think over the next 2-3 decades, at least some of those lessons are things that I think the Indian economy would do well to keep in mind, right, as it also grows. So I look forward to hosting you in India as well soon. Thanks so much.